Hi, my name's Phil. I like talking about politics, so I may well be discussing fiery working class Labour Deputy Prime Ministers more than I expected today with the news that John Prescott has passed away. There are more than the obvious features between Prescott and Rayner, which I may discuss in a separate video if I'm able to. But in this video, I'd like to discuss how Angela Rayner took apart another Conservative deputy leader, I think her fourth scalp by my count, and the ease with which she dispatched the latest Alex Burghart was not just down to her own experience in the role now, but another symptom of the problem the Conservatives have. They were so awful in government in almost every conceivable way that any vaguely credible line of attack they can fire at Labour just rebounds back on them with interest. But first, for daily political commentary, please click the subscribe button so you don't miss out. So yeah, sort of technical problem, so I'm having to record like this again instead of in the studio. There it is. But anyway, it's often the case with political exchanges that people view the winners and losers out of like tribal loyalty or personal beliefs. You know, you see it, or don't you? Person X destroys person Y, and what you actually mean is, no, you agree with person X and you don't agree with person Y, so you thought person X won the debate. It's pointless, really. If you're representative, even if you think they're right, if they're doing badly and your opponent is doing well, you're better off facing up to it if you want things to improve. Because swing voters, you know, the people who matter, they don't take a tribal view of the exchanges. But I mean, just look at this. After being picked apart for 5 questions, Burghart stood up for his final salvo. I mean, I'll go over what he said later on, but just look at how he's behaving. Leaning right over the dispatch box, shouting so much he was spitting and going so red in the face. He actually reminded me of another Conservative MP, Edward Lee, who I often call the human beetroot. It was like watching a toddler tantrum in full swing. And whatever impact he thought he was having completely failed when Angela Rayner stood up, calm as you like, and actually just laughed. That was easy, she must have thought. Because it is a serious job. You know, PMQs, it's an opportunity for MPs to press the government on what they think are important issues, but there's another side to it as well. You know, for the Conservatives especially, leading the opposition, it's a chance to trip the government up with one eye on replacing them the following election. Now, if the MP asking a question, if they think it's a damaging line of attack on the government, they will clip themselves asking the question and share it on social media for their followers, right? But if the government leader or deputy leader gives a good account of themselves, well, then those supportive of the government will be sharing that response around on social media as well. So that's what you want. But you just look at the contrast here. Burghart shouting at the top of his lungs like a psychotic manager who's lost control of a project and is looking for staff to blame. And Rayner, who can do nothing but just laugh at how easy it all was. So why was it so easy? Well, Burghart initially, and I thought foolishly, asked what the government are doing to bring inflation down. He was building up to the news that inflation is predicted to go as high as 3% in the next year, though it is then expected to fall, assuming the orange one does not monkey about. But what the Tories never seem to understand is 3% increase in costs is not what people feel. What they feel is our costs going up by more than their income. So if their income is going up by at least the amount of their personal inflation, they're not that bothered about the percentage CPI inflation, then actually it's fine. And minimum wage is going up by more than that amount. Public sector pay has gone up by more than that amount. Those moves put pressure on the private sector to maintain inflationary pay awards as well. Now, those on benefits and who get the bulk of their incomes from benefits, not quite so well off. But remember, the Tories don't care about those anyway. And the focus, as always, is on working people. But anyway, Rayner did not give her opposite number a lesson in basic percentages. She just had a much easier line. She stood up, reminded everyone that Burghart was, do you know who he was? The Minister for Growth in Liz Truss's government. And then she pointed out when inflation hit 11%. And this is the problem for the Tories. See, they have put into key positions people who have their own personal fingerprints all over the disastrous record of the party in government. What they should have done was, if they're going to get some of the old guard in, get the ones where you can't really pin them down on anything personally, that although the Tory government was disastrous, the Tory party was disastrous in government, there were some individual ministers who weren't responsible for any of the great tragedies. But anyway, Burghart was not to be deterred. If he had any brains, he'd have known what the response was going to be anyway. So he said, well, first we had the above inflation pay rises for unions when the government don't actually pay unions, which is more the pity. I actually think it would be much better if there was an expectation that all workers were members of a union and that, you know, that was subsidised by the government. But anyway. He also said that the OBR said the budget would push up inflation. Now, indeed it did. Absolutely. To below the increase in people's incomes, which is the point, as I say. So that means real terms prices will not be rising at all when compared to people's wages. So he asked Rayner, does you agree that the government's decisions mean higher inflation? And he said, for working people. So he's trying to get Labour on a gotcha here. And Rayner just stood up and asked 11.1% or 3% and sat back down again. Now, okay, the answer did the trick, but I'd have gone further. I'd have said that Burghart himself has just admitted that working people are getting above inflation pay increases. So if you're getting above inflation pay increases, then by definition, no, it doesn't mean higher inflation for working people at all. It might mean higher inflation for his rich paymasters. But the response did the trick anyway, because then Burghart seemed to forget about his third question for a moment and went into this long explainer about how COVID and the war in Ukraine stoked inflation. And it's like, true, yeah, we would have had higher than target inflation, significantly higher than target inflation, if the government at the time was still managing the economy as well as it reasonably could. However, inflation should not have gone up to 11%. It went up that high because of various inflation boosting policies the Conservatives has, like, I don't know, casually crashing the pound. But the thing is, Burghart had only asked 2 questions and he was already on the defensive. He was defending. Angela Rayner hadn't actually had to produce a defensive response at this point. He was now being defensive. And people have sort of said in the past, you know, Keir Starmer, there were a lot of times where Rishi Sunak or Boris Johnson, whoever he was up against, I suppose Liz Truss for a few minutes, and they would try and attack line on Labour to distract, and people would say, well, why doesn't Starmer call them out on that? Because that's not true. And he had this attitude of just forging ahead with his own line and not getting distracted. And I suppose part of the rationale for that is the opposition should not look like it's on the defensive in PMQs. It should be the government on the back foot. But anyway, then he turned to the farmers' protest. Now, this was inevitable. In fact, I was surprised they didn't allocate all 6 questions to it. And in hindsight, they probably should have done because they got nowhere with those inflation questions. Naturally, he laid it on thick about the way people's way of life is being destroyed. But that just gave Rayner the opportunity to remind people that Labour are spending over £5 billion on farming budgets over the next 2 years alone. And she pointed out that the Tories own much lower subsidies. Remember, they promised to match the EU subsidies. That did not occur, did it? But she was pointing out that the Tories' much lower subsidies, like there were over £300 million that the government had allocated to farmers that did not go to farmers, didn't get spent. So the idea that the Tories are on the side of farmers is absolutely laughable. And Burghart then tried to describe the case of a specific example farm that was going to be hit. Thing is, his figures suggested that this estate would be worth at least £5.5 million. And he suggested that thousands and thousands of farms are going to be made unviable with the inheritance tax changes. So thousands of farms just like these, which is completely untrue, by the way, on multiple levels. Like, even if you go by the farmers' own figures, and there's reason to think they're a little dubious, it's nowhere near that many, like nowhere near at all. In fact, nobody is arguing that the total number of farms affected is more than a few hundred. And given that everyone agrees that the majority of those farms are owned by multimillionaires, in some cases billionaires, who are not only not farmers themselves, but they won't like paying that inheritance tax, but nobody's going to the wall as a result of it. So even the farmers, really, when you pin down to what they're objectively saying, they are suggesting that it's only going to negatively impact a very small number of farms. It's just that the government are saying, no, it's not even going to affect them. No one is suggesting it's thousands and thousands. And Rayner just responded that the government figures are correct, and being clear, it's only farmers who are saying they're not. I haven't seen independent experts saying that the government are getting this wrong. And then she reminded people that actual farming families pay nothing on the first £3 million and get 10 years interest-free payback on half the amount of inheritance tax beyond that. Burghart then retreated into public sector pay. So he first of all completely undermined his own arguments. So he then tried the line that the new inheritance tax rules will raise an average of £441 million a year. Now, incidentally, I'm just going to say, it's not strict. I mean, he won't be just making that up. He'll have based it on something. But given that the Conservatives aim to win the next election, and given that they've said they would scrap this inheritance tax change, right? So really, his figures should be based on this Parliament, because as far as the Conservatives are concerned, Labour in power for one term, right? And actually, by my calculations, it's not a difficult calculation. The average would be £353 million a year, not 441. But we won't split hairs between friends. The point Burghart was making is it doesn't raise very much. He was comparing it to public sector pay rises. And say, why are these people getting so much more money than farmers? It's like, maybe it's because there's a lot more of them, like literally millions more of them. But but the point he was making is it's not raising very much. And you think, well, that's odd. That's very odd, because he's just suggested that this is going to wipe out standard family farms all over the country. There's not going to be any farms left. We'll have no domestic food production. So which is it? Is this bleeding the farming sector dry, or is it raising a paltry sum? If you'll pardon the pun. And Rayner just listed a few more of the Tories' greatest economic crimes again and said she'll take no lessons from him. And then Burghart went into his toddler tantrum.
And it's the same punishment meted out to pensioners who can't afford to pay their fuel this winter. Isn't it the truth, Mr. Speaker, that if you don't vote Labour, they don't care about you?
There will be more.
I mean, just look at it. And as for shouting that Labour only help you if you vote Labour, like, not only is this demonstrably untrue, but why would he be so upset about it anyway? When it absolutely is true of the Tories in government, and explicitly true. They were openly only providing what little levelling up money they could be asked to spend in Conservative voting areas. In fact, Rishi Sunak, need we forget, was recorded as saying that he took development money from deprived Labour voting areas and gave it to affluent Conservative voting areas and said that's the right thing to do. But just as I said last week, I don't think Starmer will be losing any sleep at the prospect of facing Kemi Badenoch in PMQs based on her first two performances. I really don't think Rayner's going to be nervous about facing off against Burghart in future. In fact, looking at her body language, she may well be looking forward to the Prime Minister being out of the country on the odd Wednesday. But there we are. Those are my thoughts. Let me know yours in the comments below. If you enjoyed the video, please click the like button. And if you'd like to support the channel further, you can join for memberships. Thanks for watching. And until next time, I'll see you later.